The luxurious boutique gleamed under the warm golden glow of crystal chandeliers. Polished marble floors reflected the grandeur of velvet-lined display cases, each holding meticulously arranged luxury watches, their price tags a statement of exclusivity. The air carried the scent of imported cologne and fine leather, a world where only the elite belonged. The automatic doors slid open. A man stepped inside. He wasn't like the others. His coat was frayed, his shoes scuffed and barely holding together. His movements were hesitant, careful, like he knew he was walking into a place that wasn't meant for him. His gaze flickered across the glistening watches, admiration visible in his tired eyes. A murmur spread among the affluent customers, their hushed voices betraying judgment rather than curiosity. Behind the counter, Mark, the boutique's senior salesman, barely hid his disgust. Adjusting his gold cufflinks, he straightened his pristine blazer and strode forward. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, a sound of authority. "Sir," Mark's voice was controlled, dripping with condescension. "I'm afraid we have a dress code." The man, Daniel, flinched but stood his ground. "I just wanted to look," he said quietly. Mark smirked. "People don't just look here. They buy." Several customers chuckled under their breath. Others turned away, unwilling to acknowledge the scene unfolding before them. The tension thickened as Mark took a deliberate step closer. "I suggest you leave before security asks you to." But what Mark didn't notice was the quiet observer standing nearby. Dressed simply in a black jacket and worn jeans, Keanu Reeves leaned casually against the counter, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. His expression was unreadable, but there was a slight knowing smile. This was about to get interesting. A lesson in humility was about to unfold, and the salesman had no idea what was coming. Keanu had seen enough. It was time to step in. Keanu Reeves was a man who needed no introduction. A Hollywood legend, yet a mystery to many. Unlike most celebrities, he lived by a different set of rules, ones that weren't dictated by fame, money, or status. He wasn't the type to flaunt his success, nor did he seek attention. Instead, he believed in actions over words, and today, his presence in the luxury boutique was about to prove exactly that. Keanu stood casually near the counter, dressed in his usual understated style. Black jacket. Worn jeans. Scuffed boots. If one didn't recognize his face, he could easily pass as an ordinary man. That's how he preferred it. He didn't need extravagant suits or flashy jewelry to prove his worth. His presence alone commanded respect. Yet, at that moment, no one recognized him. His deep, observant eyes scanned the unfolding situation. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, people who believed that wealth equaled superiority. It never failed to amuse him how quickly judgment was passed based on appearances. And today, the target of that judgment was Daniel. Daniel, a man with a story unseen. Daniel wasn't always homeless. Once upon a time, he was a talented artist. His hands had painted breathtaking landscapes, his canvases had been admired in local galleries. Art was his soul's language, and for years, he had dreams of making a name for himself in the art world. But life had other plans. A series of unfortunate events, a tragic accident, mounting medical bills, and the loss of a loved one, shattered the foundation he had built. In a blink, the life he once knew crumbled beneath his feet. He had tried to hold on, but society had a cruel way of turning its back on those who struggled. The very people who once admired his art no longer recognized his face. Now, he spent his days wandering, surviving on the kindness of strangers. Not for handouts, not for pity, but simply to get by. And yet, despite everything, he never lost his appreciation for beauty. That's why he had walked into the boutique today. Not to buy, not to beg, but to admire. Just for a moment, he wanted to feel like his old self again. Like the man who once dreamed of owning something beautiful. But Mark, the salesman, saw none of that. Mark, the gatekeeper of luxury. Mark had worked in the boutique for years. He prided himself on knowing his customers at a glance. He could tell the difference between someone who belonged and someone who didn't. And in his eyes, Daniel did not belong. Mark wasn't just a salesman, he was a gatekeeper. He saw himself as the protector of exclusivity, the one who ensured that the boutique remained a space for the elite. To Mark, status meant everything. His finely tailored suit, his expensive watch, the polished shoes he wore, they were badges of success. And anyone who failed to meet those standards was beneath him. When Daniel walked in, Mark didn't see a man with a story. He saw an inconvenience. A stain in an otherwise perfect environment. And now, standing in front of him, was the perfect opportunity to assert his authority. Mark's polished demeanor concealed the smug satisfaction he felt. He had power here, and he intended to use it. But there was one thing Mark didn't know. The man standing a few feet away, the quiet observer, was about to change everything. Keanu watched, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, the arrogance, the power play, the humiliation Mark was about to serve Daniel on a silver platter. But what Mark didn't realize was that today, his test wasn't just about how he treated a customer. It was about how he treated a human being. And Keanu wasn't about to let this lesson go unlearned. More observers began to notice. While Mark remained fixated on Daniel, dismissing him as unworthy of the store's presence, other customers in the boutique began to take notice. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether they should say something. Others pretended not to see, unwilling to get involved. An elderly woman near the display case hesitated, gripping the edge of the glass as she watched. She had seen enough of this in her lifetime, people being judged not by their character, but by their clothes, their bank accounts, their ability to fit in. A young couple whispered amongst themselves, their eyes flicking between Mark and Daniel. Discomfort settled over them. They had walked in just moments before and had barely noticed the quiet man admiring the watches. Now, all they could see was how the world was treating him. Keanu shifted his stance slightly, his fingers tapping against the counter in silent thought. He had seen enough. This wasn't just about a homeless man being humiliated. It was about something much bigger. It was about power. Who had it, who believed they deserved it, and who used it to push others down. And Keanu wasn't the kind of man to stay silent when he saw injustice unfold. With one small movement, one decision, he was about to turn the entire room upside down. Mark exhaled sharply, his annoyance barely concealed as he took another step closer to Daniel. His arms were crossed, his neatly pressed sleeves pulling slightly as if his patience was wearing just as thin. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Mark said, his voice now sharper, more commanding. He no longer cared to keep up the pretense of politeness. Daniel hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. His hands, roughened by years of hardship, clenched at his sides. He wasn't trying to cause trouble. He wasn't asking for anything. He just wanted a moment. "I'm not here to steal," Daniel said softly. "I just wanted to look." Mark's expression twisted into a smirk. "That's the thing, sir. People like you don't just look in stores like this." A few customers snickered, their eyes casting downward glances at Daniel's tattered coat and worn-out shoes. Others simply ignored the confrontation, unwilling to get involved. Daniel felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up his throat. It wasn't the first time he had been treated this way, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But before he could turn away, a voice cut through the tension. "Is this how you treat customers?" It wasn't loud, but it was steady, calm, and carried an unmistakable weight that froze the room. Mark turned his head sharply toward the sound. A man stood a few feet away, arms crossed loosely over his chest, watching the scene unfold with an unreadable expression. Keanu Reeves. The first shift in power. Mark didn't recognize him at first. He saw only a man in a plain jacket and jeans, standing too casually for someone who belonged in this kind of store. His dismissive instincts kicked in immediately. "This doesn't concern you," Mark said smoothly, turning back toward Daniel. But Keanu didn't move. Instead, he took a slow step forward, positioning himself slightly between Mark and Daniel. The shift was small, but noticeable, a silent statement that did not go unnoticed by the watching customers. "I asked you a question," Keanu repeated, his voice still calm but firmer now. "Is this how you treat your customers?" Mark forced a tight-lipped smile. He had handled rude customers before, even self-righteous ones who thought they knew better. "With all due respect," Mark said, "I know how to do my job." Keanu didn't flinch. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, remained locked on Mark. "And I know how to recognize when someone's being treated unfairly," Keanu countered. Mark's expression flickered, just for a second. A barely noticeable crack in his confidence. "This man," Mark gestured to Daniel, "does not belong here. He's wasting time. Our time." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if studying the salesman. "And who decides that?" Keanu asked. His voice wasn't challenging, it was curious. Mark scoffed. "I think we both know the answer to that." A murmur rippled through the store. A few people recognized Keanu now. Whispers spread, eyes widened. The tone in the room shifted. But Mark? Mark still had no idea who he was talking to. Daniel's silent shame. Daniel stood frozen, unsure of whether he should stay or leave. His heart pounded, but not just from the confrontation. He wasn't used to people standing up for him. His entire life had been a battle of survival, and he had long accepted that people saw him as invisible, or worse, as an inconvenience. But this stranger, whoever he was, wasn't letting it slide. Daniel glanced at Keanu, uncertain. Why was he doing this? Keanu must have sensed his hesitation, because he turned slightly toward him, offering the smallest nod. A silent reassurance. It was a simple gesture, but it hit Daniel harder than he expected. Mark's growing frustration. Mark exhaled sharply, his confidence waning for the first time. He had expected Daniel to back down. To tuck his tail and slink away, as most like him did. What he hadn't expected was a customer to intervene. Especially not one as calmly unyielding as Keanu. Mark squared his shoulders. He still had the upper hand. "This is a high-end boutique," he said, his tone clipped. "Not a shelter. If you don't mind, I have real customers to attend to." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Real customers?" he echoed. Mark gestured toward the other shoppers, most of whom were now watching intently. "People who can actually afford to shop here." Keanu's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "So that's what matters to you?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Of course. That's how business works." Keanu let the silence stretch. He didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. He just watched. And under that steady gaze, Mark began to feel something unexpected. Doubt. A sliver of uncertainty crept into his chest. Because suddenly, Keanu didn't seem like just any customer. There was something different about him. And then, the moment that changed everything. Keanu makes his move. With a slow, deliberate motion, Keanu reached into his pocket. Mark's breath caught. For a split second, his mind raced. Was this guy about to call security? Pull out his phone and record? But then, Keanu placed something small, sleek, and unmistakable onto the counter. A black credit card. The highest tier. The kind that could buy everything in the store 10 times over. Silence dropped over the boutique. Mark stared at it. Then back at Keanu. Then back at the card. And just like that, his face drained of color. Because suddenly, everything clicked. The casual clothes. The unshakable confidence. The fact that this man, this seemingly ordinary man, had stepped in with a quiet authority that commanded the entire room. Mark swallowed hard. He knew exactly who he had just disrespected. Keanu Reeves. And it was far too late to undo his mistake. This is where the power shift happens. Mark realizes he's been exposed. The atmosphere in the boutique shifted entirely. The hushed murmurs of curious customers, the frozen expressions of the staff, and the sudden realization dawning on Mark's face, all pointed to a moment no one had expected. Mark could feel it now. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in his career, he was the one being scrutinized. But his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Mark forced a stiff smile, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "Mr. Reeves," he said, desperately trying to maintain control, "I think you misunderstand. We have policies in place to ensure our clientele receives the best service. You can surely understand that, can't you?" Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "Oh, I understand," he said smoothly, his tone carrying an unmistakable edge. "I understand that you only offer the best service to people who meet your standards." Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He had backed himself into a very dangerous corner. The other employees, sensing the tension, exchanged worried glances. The store manager, who had up until now stayed in the background, was turning paler by the second. The silence in the store stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Daniel broke it. "I don't need anything," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "I shouldn't have come in." Keanu turned to him, his expression softening. "Why not?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "Because I don't belong here." Keanu's jaw tightened just slightly. He let out a slow breath, then gave a small shake of his head. "Who told you that?" Daniel blinked in confusion. Keanu turned back to Mark. "Him?" He motioned toward the salesman, who visibly flinched under the weight of Keanu's unwavering gaze. "Somebody like him decides where you belong?" Daniel's lips parted, but no words came out. Keanu nodded, as if he had already expected the silence. "That's the problem," he continued, his voice calm but firm. "People like him decide that people like you aren't worth respect. And the worst part? You start to believe them." Daniel froze. Because Keanu was right. For years, he had accepted the way people looked at him. The whispers. The assumptions. The judgment. He had accepted that society had cast him aside. But here was Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous people in the world, telling him otherwise. Telling him that he mattered. Mark's final attempt to regain control. Mark couldn't take it anymore. His pride, his ego, the authority he once held in this store, it was slipping away, and he was losing fast. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice trembling just slightly. "You can't just walk in here and—" Keanu raised an eyebrow. "And what?" Mark clamped his mouth shut. Because the truth was, he didn't have an answer. He had relied on wealth and status to dictate who mattered and who didn't. And now, that very system had turned against him. Because in this moment, his wealth meant nothing. His arrogance meant nothing. And Keanu Reeves? He didn't need power. He was power. Keanu's quiet power move. Keanu sighed, his patience thinning. He looked at the cashier, a young woman who had been standing awkwardly behind the counter, clearly uncomfortable. "Can you open the case?" he asked. The cashier hesitated, looking at Mark. Mark didn't speak. So she nodded and reached for the keys. The quiet click of the glass unlocking sounded like a gunshot in the silent store. Mark's breath hitched. Keanu gestured toward the watches. Go ahead, Daniel, he said. Pick whatever you like. Daniel stared. Mark gaped. The other customers gasped. For Daniel, this felt like some cruel joke. He had never been given a choice before. Never had the luxury of picking something that wasn't handed to him out of pity. His fingers hovered hesitantly over the display case. I can't, he whispered. It's too much. Keanu smiled gently. It's not about the money, he said. It's about proving a point. Daniel's fingers finally touched the glass. Mark lost his composure. This is ridiculous, he burst out, his voice higher than before. He can't afford this, even if you. Keanu's gaze snapped to him. The sudden sharpness in his eyes stopped Mark cold. I didn't ask for your opinion. The statement was calm, quiet, and absolute. Mark's mouth snapped shut so fast, it was almost audible. The other customers speak up. The tension was unbearable now. And then, for the first time since the ordeal started, someone else spoke up. A middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed, narrowed her eyes at Mark. You know, she mused, loud enough for everyone to hear, I was considering buying something here today. But if this is how your staff treats people, I think I'll take my business elsewhere. A few others nodded in agreement. Mark stiffened. Wait, now, hold on, he started. But it was too late. Keanu had done more than put him in his place. He had exposed him. And now, Mark was losing customers because of it. The humiliation finally sank in. Mark had played the game and lost. And Keanu? He hadn't even needed to raise his voice. Daniel's decision. With shaky hands, Daniel reached into the case. His fingers grazed the surface of a sleek, silver watch. He hesitated. Keanu, standing beside him, gave a small nod of encouragement. Daniel took a breath. And then, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to choose. He lifted the watch carefully, setting it on the counter. Keanu nodded at the cashier. Ring it up. Mark looked like he was going to faint. The cashier, smiling nervously, pressed a few buttons on the register. That'll be. Keanu slid his card across the counter before she could finish. Daniel's eyes burned. Keanu patted him on the back lightly. Now, let's get out of here. Daniel exhaled a shaky laugh. And together, they turned and walked toward the door. Keanu Reeves had just turned a moment of cruelty into one of kindness. And as the boutique's door swung closed behind them, Mark was left standing alone in his failure. As Keanu and Daniel turned toward the exit, the weight of the moment settled over the store like an impending storm. The room was still, the murmurs of the wealthy clientele now replaced by an almost deafening silence. Mark stood rooted in place, his face a mask of sheer disbelief. He had just lost control of the very store where he once dictated who mattered and who didn't. His authority, once wielded like a weapon, had been stripped from him in an instant. And the worst part? It hadn't even been through an argument, a confrontation, or a raised voice. It had been through kindness. Mark couldn't take it. His frustration boiled over as he stepped forward, desperate to reclaim some semblance of control. Wait, he called out. Keanu paused. The air in the store grew heavier as Mark clenched his fists, his composure unraveling. This isn't fair, Mark blurted, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. He doesn't deserve it. He's just a nobody off the street. What gives him the right to walk in here and get a free luxury watch? Gasps rippled through the boutique. Mark's mask of politeness had finally crumbled, revealing the raw arrogance that had been lurking beneath it all along. Keanu, however, remained completely unfazed. Slowly, he turned back around, his eyes locking onto Mark with a look so calm, yet so piercing, that the salesman took an instinctive step back. I was wondering when you'd finally say it, Keanu mused, his voice light, but his words sharp as a blade. Mark's breath hitched. Keanu took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. So tell me, he continued, his tone still impossibly calm, what exactly makes someone deserving, in your eyes? Mark stammered. Well, I mean, it's just. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Money? Mark swallowed hard. Keanu let the silence hang. Then, he let out a quiet chuckle and shook his head. That's the problem with people like you, he said, his voice soft but laced with undeniable power. You think a person's worth is measured by their bank account. By their clothes. By whether or not they look like they belong in a place like this. Mark's face burned. You think because someone is struggling, because they don't have the same privileges you do, they don't deserve respect. Mark's lips parted, as if searching for an excuse, but there wasn't one. Keanu's expression hardened just slightly. But tell me something, he continued. What does it say about you, that you need to step on others just to feel important? The weight of Keanu's words settled like a final verdict. Mark's chest rose and fell sharply, his breathing erratic. He could feel the judgment of the other customers now, not on Daniel, but on him. This was the moment. The moment where he realized. He was the outcast now. The final blow. The store manager, having finally processed what was happening, stepped forward. His eyes flickered to Keanu, then to Mark, his expression unreadable. Mark, he said, his voice eerily calm. Mark turned, his heart sinking. The manager let out a long sigh before shaking his head. I think we've had enough of your customer service tactics. Mark's stomach dropped. No. No, this couldn't be happening. Sir, please, I didn't. The manager held up a hand. You can collect your things and leave. Mark's eyes widened in horror. The murmurs in the store grew louder. The same customers who once admired him were now whispering about his downfall. His own arrogance had written his resignation. Desperate, Mark whirled back toward Keanu. Please, he pleaded, his tone shifting to one of desperation. You're a good person, right? You don't want to see me lose my job over this, do you? Keanu regarded him for a long moment, then finally spoke. You weren't worried about taking away someone's dignity, he said simply. Why should I be worried about your job? Mark's face crumbled. For the first time, he had nothing left to say. Keanu didn't need to say anything more. His silence was more powerful than any insult could ever be. And with that, he turned his back on Mark for the last time. As he and Daniel stepped toward the exit, the boutique doors swinging open before them, Mark was left standing alone, stripped of everything he once thought made him superior. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be on the outside. As Keanu and Daniel walked away, whispers began to stir among the other customers. That was incredible, a woman murmured. Honestly, I was going to buy something today, another said, folding her arms. But after seeing how this store treats people, I'll be taking my business elsewhere. A well-dressed older man approached the counter, pulling out his own credit card. He gestured toward a collection of watches. I'd like to purchase one, he said, his voice firm. And I'd like it to go to him. He turned toward Daniel. Daniel's eyes widened. I can't accept this, he said, shaking his head. You don't have to do this. The older man smiled warmly. I know I don't. He placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder. But after seeing how that man treated you, I think it's time for the rest of us to set a better example. More murmurs of agreement spread throughout the boutique. Mark, still standing frozen in place, watched in horror. Not only had he been publicly humiliated, he had turned his own customers against him. Outside the boutique, Keanu and Daniel walked side by side in comfortable silence. After a few moments, Daniel spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Nobody's ever stood up for me like that before." Keanu smiled. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Just remember that your worth isn't decided by people like him." Daniel swallowed hard, nodding. Keanu patted him on the back lightly. "Now, let's get out of here." As they stepped into the street, the boutique door swinging shut behind them, Daniel couldn't help but steal one last glance over his shoulder. Inside, Mark stood completely alone. And with that, Daniel turned away, walking forward with newfound confidence. Because today wasn't just about a watch. It was about proving that dignity, kindness, and respect weren't reserved for the wealthy. And Keanu had just reminded the world of that. Outside the boutique, the crisp evening air wrapped around Daniel as he walked beside Keanu. The city lights flickered above them, casting a warm glow on the streets bustling with people who had no idea what had just transpired inside that luxury store. For the first time in what felt like years, Daniel didn't feel invisible. He glanced at Keanu, still unable to process what had just happened. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Keanu smirked slightly, shoving his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "Then don't say anything," he said simply. But Daniel had to say something. "I never expected this," he admitted, shaking his head. "I just wanted to look at the watches, to remember what it felt like. Even for a second." His throat tightened. "But that guy, he made me feel so small." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady as they walked. "That's the thing about people like him," he said. "They believe their power comes from making others feel unworthy." Daniel sighed. "I've met plenty of people like him." Keanu gave a knowing smile. "Yeah. So have I." For a moment, Daniel just walked, absorbing everything. Then he glanced down at the bag in his hands, the one holding a watch far too valuable for someone like him. "I can't keep this," he said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "It doesn't feel right. It's too much." Keanu stopped too, turning toward him. His expression was unreadable for a moment before a small, amused smirk tugged at his lips. "Why?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. Because it was a gift. I didn't earn it." Keanu arched a brow. "And?" Daniel blinked at him. Keanu sighed, tilting his head slightly. "Daniel, not everything in life has to be earned. Kindness? Dignity? Respect? Those aren't things you work for. Those are things you deserve." Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of Keanu's words sinking in. Keanu motioned toward the watch bag. "That's not just about money," he said. "It's about reminding you of your worth. And if keeping that watch makes you second-guess it, then you need to start seeing yourself the way I do." Daniel stared at him, his chest tightening. No one had ever said something like that to him before. A long pause stretched between them before Daniel finally let out a shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," he said softly. Keanu smiled. "Good." They started walking again, but the weight on Daniel's shoulders felt just a little lighter now. Meanwhile, back at the boutique. Inside the store, Mark sat slumped on a small bench in the back, his once pristine suit now wrinkled from stress. He could still hear the faint whispers of customers in the showroom, people who had witnessed his fall from grace. He had spent years curating his perfect image, crafting a persona that demanded respect through status alone. And in just a few minutes, it had all crumbled. The manager had left him with nothing but a quiet, "You should go." The words still rang in his ears. With a shaking hand, he reached up, loosening his tie. He never expected this. He had always thought he knew the rules of life: money equaled power. Power equaled control. But today, Keanu Reeves had shattered that illusion. For the first time in his life, Mark didn't feel like the one in charge. He felt like the outsider, the one who didn't belong. And he hated it. A new beginning for Daniel. The next morning, Daniel woke up in the small shelter where he had been staying. Sunlight poured through the cracked blinds, casting long beams of light across the worn-out room. For the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. He had tucked the watch carefully beside him before falling asleep, running his fingers over the smooth surface like a lifeline. It wasn't about the watch itself, it was about what it represented. Dignity. Respect. A second chance. He took a deep breath, reaching for his bag. Maybe today, for the first time in years, he'd start looking for a job again. Maybe today, things would change. As the story comes to a close, we leave you with an important question: what truly defines a person's worth? Is it their wealth, appearance, or status? Or is it something deeper, the way they treat others when no one is watching? This story isn't just about a luxury boutique or a rude salesman. It's about dignity, respect, and the power of kindness. What would you have done in this situation? Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly? Let us know in the comments, we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story and want more heartwarming, inspiring tales of justice, redemption, and kindness, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Film Projector, watch more stories like this. Click on the screen now to watch another powerful, emotional story that will leave you thinking long after the video ends. Remember, true success isn't measured by how much you have, but by how much you give back. Kindness costs nothing, but its impact lasts forever. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next incredible story.